This video is going to talk about some of the things that we discussed when we were looking at love's philosophy in the lesson the other day. So we're going to start by talking about some of the things that we said about structure. Now, we mentioned that, first of all, it's a very simple rhyme scheme. So A, B, C, D, C, D. A very simple rhyme scheme. And you mentioned that basically the two A's are not together, the two B's are not together, and perhaps that could emphasize the fact that the two people are not yet together. The next thing we mentioned was that the rhyme between river and ever is a slightly awkward half rhyme. So perhaps that's suggesting that things are not quite right in the relationship, and that's echoed through the rhyme itself. The next thing we talked about in terms of structure was the two separate stanzas. So 2 pairs of 8 lines. We discussed whether or not the 2 stanzas could represent the 2 people in the relationship, and we discussed why it wasn't one single stanza, because they've not yet united either through a relationship or through sex or whatever it is that he might be aiming for. They're not yet together, so that would be one of the reasons why it's still separate in 2 stanzas. Makes perfect sense, so because it fits with the idea of the whole poem being about pairs. One thing we didn't really talk about was the way that both stanzas end. So why not I with thine and if thou kiss not me are both shorter than most of the other lines, and very monosyllabic, therefore making it feel like something's incomplete, and not quite right, that his argument isn't really working properly. And that also fits with the idea that you've got a question at the end of each stanza. So he's still questioning, and it's not finished. It's a rhetorical question. He's not going to get an answer. And we did have a quick discussion about whether or not the fact that it was a rhetorical question and therefore was not necessarily asking for a proper response from the receiver of this question, that maybe the pressure that's being put on the person to acquiesce to his demands was uncomfortable for us in the 21st century, even though it might have been something that was more expected perhaps previously, but certainly we feel quite uncomfortable about it. Now, other things in terms of structure, there is a certain amount of enjambment. So we discussed the fact that the enjambment might suggest that this argument continues. So he's continuing to ask questions and to put the pressure on and try and persuade this second person to become his lover. Moving on now to talk about language use, I'm just going to pick out some of the things that we talked about in the lesson. Now, we talked about, first of all, the use of words in the first stanza, much more gentle words, so words like mingle, which is repeated. So you've got 2 occasions where the word mingle is used, and mingle is a much more gentle coming together. And we talked about that contrasting with words like clasp and kiss in the second stanza, which are much more insistent and determined. Clasp, for example, creates a much more insistent tone just from the way that it includes various different plosives. So it starts with quite a hard C sound, a uvular plosive. It ends with a bilabial plosive, and it's got quite an uncomfortable sibilance in the middle of the word. So it's a word that has quite a definite feel to it. So it feels much more insistent, almost as if he's becoming frustrated because his argument isn't having the effect that he wanted it to have. We also talked about the predominance of natural imagery, that really his use of the personification of nature and natural imagery to underline his argument is really him saying that sex is a natural thing, and therefore what would be more natural than her having sex with him. We also talked about the use of religious imagery, that perhaps what he's saying through his use of religious imagery there, heaven, divine, that what he's saying there is that even God approves. God would approve of her coming together with him. So those were some of the things that we talked about there. Here, in the second stanza, we talked about the the increasing insistence that he's using, even now in his imagery, is he's saying here, no sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. It's really saying the pressure in that argument is saying, neither will you be forgiven if you don't do the natural thing, which is come together with me. So, much more passionate, urgent, forceful ideas. And in this stanza, the natural imagery is extended so that we're not just talking about fountains and rivers, we're talking about the heavens and the wider universe, the earth, the moon, heaven. The whole universe seems to be urging them together, according to his arguments. So again, it's a very insistent idea of why, it's really taking away any argument that one might have. Maybe one of the last things that we talked about, we talked about the use of the word and, almost as if it's loading one argument on top of the next. So it's almost, for the receiver of these arguments, becomes something that it would be difficult to avoid. And finally, we talked about the fact that there are no full stops in the poem. Certainly in the one in our anthology there aren't. So there's one in this version that I got off the internet here, but in our version in the anthology there are no full stops, and the significance of that would be that his argument is not complete. He's going to continue this argument, so he's not finished. He'll continue to try and persuade her around to his point of view.